Snow fell the way ash falls after a fire, slow, restless, and without end. It clung to the warped rooflines of the small frontier town, whispered against shuttered windows, and swirled through the air in pale, patient spirals. By mid-afternoon, the world had narrowed to white. The streets were muffled under its weight, and every step crunched like breaking old bones. Somewhere far away, a bell rang, muted by the wind, and then the sound was gone, swallowed by the storm. Through that white silence, a small figure moved. She was barely more than a shadow against the drifting snow, her scarf loose around her neck, her coat patched in 2 places, and her boots a size too large. A canvas sack hung from her mittened hand, flour, no doubt, the kind of family stretched thin through long winters. She walked with the stubborn rhythm of someone used to distance, head bowed, hair like dark ink against the snow. The wind turned, pushing the flakes sideways. She tried to keep her footing on the slick boards outside the livery, but a voice stopped her. "Well, if it ain't the little half-breed princess." 3 boys stepped out from behind the stacked hay bales. They were older, taller, wrapped in heavy coats with their cheeks red from cold. The tallest was Sammy Carter, his father's mean streak already showing in the tilt of his mouth. The other 2 flanked him, hands buried deep in their pockets, grins sharp enough to cut. "What's in the bag?" Sammy asked, stepping closer. The girl's chin lifted, just a fraction. "Flour." "Flour," he repeated, drawing the word out. "Paid for with scalper's gold, I bet." Her fingers tightened around the sack. She tried to step past, but he moved to block her path, the tip of his boot coming down hard on hers. One of the others gave a short laugh. The bag swung as she tried to pull away, and in that moment Sammy snatched it. It was quick, too quick for her to react. He tore the sack open with a twist of his hands, and the white powder billowed into the air before collapsing into the snow at their feet. For an instant it looked like the storm itself had dropped between them, blinding her, stinging her eyes. "You shouldn't even be here," one of the boys muttered. "This is a white man's town." She bent to gather the spilled flour, her mittens turning ghost white. Sammy gave her shoulder a shove, and she slipped, striking the hard ice beneath with a sound that made the smallest boy flinch. But no one helped her. "What's going on here?" The voice carried a weight that didn't come from volume. Marshal Ezra Boone stood just beyond the doorway of the livery, snow clinging to the brim of his hat. His coat was buttoned to his throat, his gloved hand resting near the worn grip of his Colt. Sammy straightened, his smirk fading into something more cautious. "Nothin', Marshal. Just talkin'. Boone's eyes swept over the scene, the spilled flour, the girl on the ground, and then fixed on the boys. "Go home. All of you." Sammy opened his mouth, thought better of it, and turned away. The others followed, their boots thudding against the frozen boards, until the sound was lost in the wind. The girl stayed where she was, one hand braced on the ice. Boone took a step toward her, but another figure had already moved in from across the street. Evelyn Harper, her skirts lifting just above the snow, crossed quickly, her basket swinging at her side. She set it down and knelt, wrapping the girl's scarf tighter. "You're bleeding," Evelyn murmured. A thin line of red marked the girl's temple where it met her dark hair. "Come on. Let's get you out of the cold." The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking once toward the road as if expecting someone. Then she let Evelyn help her up. Boone stepped aside, saying nothing, though his gaze lingered on Evelyn. When she guided the girl toward the small clinic at the edge of town, his voice followed. "Best leave it be, Mrs. Harper," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "That one's got trouble tied to her." Evelyn didn't answer. She kept her arm steady around the girl's shoulders, feeling the shiver in her frame. The clinic's door groaned as she pushed it open, the smell of boiled linen and old whiskey drifting out. Doc Abel Raines looked up from a ledger, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Lord above, what happened?" "She fell," Evelyn said, guiding the girl to a chair near the stove. The girl sat without a word, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Evelyn took off the mittens, brushing flour from them, and laid them on the stove rail to dry. Doc cleaned the cut, his movements brisk but not unkind. "You've got to be careful in weather like this," he said. though he seemed to know she hadn't fallen by accident. He wrapped her head in a strip of clean linen, tying it neatly. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Snow pressed against the glass, trying to get in. Evelyn glanced toward it and saw only her own reflection in the dim light, until a shadow moved through the white. Tall. Broad. The shape of a man walking with the kind of purpose that eats distance. She blinked, and for a moment thought she imagined it. No one sane walked bareheaded in this storm, much less bare-chested. But the figure came on, snow melting against the heat of his skin, steam rising faintly from the long muscles of his shoulders. The door opened without a knock. The cold came in with him, curling around the edges of the room like a living thing. He filled the doorway, a man with hair black as the storm was white, eyes dark and steady, a faint scar running from collarbone to shoulder. He said nothing at first, only crossed the floor in 3 steps and knelt before the girl. "Tala," he said, and the name held both relief and command. Her face changed, softened, brightened, and she whispered, "I knew you'd come." He gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, speaking to her in a language Evelyn didn't understand. The words were low, flowing, almost like a prayer. She clung to him, her fingers curling into his hair. Evelyn stood, her hands tightening on her skirts. The man's presence filled the room, not loud, not forceful, but like a fire too close to stand beside for long. He glanced at her once, and in that look she felt both measured and acknowledged. He turned toward the door. Snow had already begun to gather in his hair. "Sir," Boone's voice came from the doorway, the marshal framed against the white storm. "I'll tell you once, keep her close. There's folks here who'd see her gone." The man's reply was quiet, each word deliberate. "She will not walk alone again." He stepped past Boone into the storm. Evelyn watched them disappear, the white swallowing them whole. The wind rose, and the door shuddered in its frame. Somewhere deep in her chest, she knew this wasn't over. Whatever storm had carried them into town, it wasn't done yet. And the snow kept falling, like ash from a fire still burning just out of sight. The wind had only sharpened by the time Evelyn stepped out of the clinic. Snow came in thick waves, curling down the street in ghost-like swirls, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath clouding in the air, and glanced toward the end of the street where she'd last seen them, father and daughter swallowed by the storm. For the rest of the day, she caught fragments of their passing from other mouths. The grocer muttering that a shirtless savage had no place here. Mary Lou Carter's voice, carrying from the porch of the boarding house, weaving rumor into something uglier. "He'll bring trouble, mark my words." "And that widow Harper?" "She's already meddling." Evelyn had learned long ago that in small towns, you didn't have to step wrong for people to say you had. Sometimes, all it took was being seen. That evening, lanterns lit the street in pale gold pockets against the white dark. Evelyn was returning from the mercantile, with a small sack of beans when she saw him again. Chayton, they called him, though no one spoke his name without a glance over the shoulder. He sat on a low stool outside the farrier's, bare skin steaming faintly in the cold, hands working a block of wood with a small blade. Shavings curled to the ground like thin ribbons. She hesitated, boots sinking in the drifted snow. It was not a man's size he carved, but something smaller, a sled, she realized. The runners were smooth, shaped to cut over ice and snow, the edges sanded as if for small, careful hands. The thought of Tala's laughter, that brief brightness she had seen when the girl first looked at him, caught at Evelyn unexpectedly. The snow ticked against her cheeks. She crossed the street, leaving her own shallow footprints to fill. When she was close enough to hear the steady scrape of his blade, she said, "You'll freeze out here." He didn't look up right away. His dark hair hung damp over his shoulders, a few strands caught in the rough grain of the wood. When he did meet her eyes, it was with the kind of calm that did not belong to men who feared cold, or people. "You shouldn't work with wet hands in this weather," she tried again, softer. He set the blade down, the motion unhurried, and looked at the small sack she carried. She untied it and drew out a loaf of bread, still warm from the mercantile's oven, its scent cutting through the bitter air. "For you," she said. His gaze shifted between her face and the bread. He didn't reach for it, as though accepting something from her might mean more than the thing itself. Then, without a word, he returned to carving. Evelyn placed the bread on the stool beside him. "You'll want to eat it while it's warm," she murmured, and turned to leave. She had taken only a few steps when she heard a soft sound, the crust breaking. By the next morning, the storm had eased, the world remade into a landscape of smooth white curves and glittering frost. Evelyn saw Tala with him at the far end of the road. He held the small sled in one hand, guiding her with the other as she learned to balance on its narrow runners. She was laughing, clear and unguarded, and for a moment it was only the sound, not the sight, that told Evelyn she was still a child. From the porch of the general store, Mary Lou's voice drifted over. "She's making herself a story, that one. Alone in the world, and now keeping company with." The rest dissolved into a hiss of disapproval. Evelyn's hands tightened around the jar of coffee she carried. Later, as she crossed the square, Marshal Boone stopped her. His eyes were shadowed under the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Harper," he said low, "I've seen men like him. Strong enough to stand alone. But a man like that with a girl like her, in a town like this, it'll draw fire. Be sure you're ready to be burned if you're standing close." She met his gaze steadily. "And what if standing close is the only decent thing to do?" Boone didn't answer. That afternoon, Evelyn noticed something strange. Passing the small cabin on the edge of town, the one someone had let him use for the winter, she saw a line of fresh boot tracks looping wide around it. They hadn't been there in the morning. They were deliberate, pacing, watching. She didn't knock. She simply walked to where he was splitting kindling behind the cabin. He was bare to the waist again, breath rising in even puffs, the axe falling in a rhythm that felt as much a part of him as his heartbeat. "There were men outside," she said. He straightened, the axe resting against his shoulder. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Only his eyes changed, darkening in a way that made the cold feel sharper. "You should know," she added quietly. He inclined his head once. "I know." Something in her wanted to ask more, but she didn't. She turned to go, only to find him setting down the axe and walking toward her. "Where is your house?" he asked. She blinked at the sudden question. "3 doors from the smithy." From that evening on, she noticed him in the distance whenever she returned home after dark. He didn't speak, didn't walk beside her, only trailed far enough back that it might have seemed coincidence, until the moment she reached her door and saw him turn away into the snow. On the third night, she stopped halfway to her porch and turned. He paused in the street, white flakes catching in his hair. "You don't have to do this," she said. His voice was deep, unhurried. "Some storms you watch from inside. Some you walk through." She didn't know if he meant the weather or the people. As he turned to go, her eyes fell to his hands. They trembled slightly. Not from the cold. Not from fear. From holding something back. And though she couldn't name it, she knew it wasn't the last time she'd see that restraint tested. By late January, the snow had become part of the town's bones. It lay thick on the rooftops, crusted hard over fence rails, and drifted in long wind-sculpted shapes that made the streets feel narrower. Footprints never lasted. The wind smoothed them away within hours. But Evelyn had begun to notice the ones that lingered. Deliberate paths pressed deep into the whiteness, circling, pausing. The first time she saw them, she was carrying a pail of water from the pump to her small house. They weren't random, like a dog or child might leave, but measured, each step wide apart, the stride of a grown man. They began at the edge of town, and looped around Chayton's cabin, before vanishing toward the Carter Ranch Road. She didn't mention it to him until the second time, when the tracks were joined by another set, smaller but still heavy, like 2 men had been there. When she told him, he only looked at her for a long moment, snowflakes melting in his hair. "I know," he said again, in that same quiet way that gave nothing else away. She wanted to ask why he hadn't stopped them, but she already knew. It wasn't yet time to show his teeth. One pale morning after the latest storm, Evelyn crossed the hill behind the church and saw him with Tala. He had fashioned a rope handle for the small sled, and was guiding her down the slope. She leaned forward, her laugh sharp against the still air, hair streaming behind her. He stood at the bottom, ready to catch her if she tumbled. It was the first time Evelyn had seen the girl unguarded, joy plain on her face. It drew something in Evelyn's chest tight and warm at once. She stayed at the top of the hill longer than she meant to, watching them without being seen. By the time she walked into town, the mood had shifted. Mary Lou Carter was on the porch of the general store, speaking in that voice that carried just far enough for the right ears to hear. "It's one thing for the marshal to let an Indian stay in our town," she said, pretending to arrange the jars in her basket. "But now he's got a widow sniffin' around him. Can't be long before folks start wonderin' what she's been doing in the evenings." Evelyn kept walking, head high. The words lodged like splinters, but she'd learned not to show the sting. Still, they followed her into the mercantile, rattled faintly in her mind as she paid for beans and kerosene. That afternoon, Marshal Boone caught her on the boardwalk outside the post office. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone low, "Jed Carter's been in my ear twice this week. Says he doesn't want Chayton anywhere near town, and he sure doesn't want his boy near that girl." "He ought to keep his boy away from her then," Evelyn replied. Boone's jaw shifted. "You're not wrong. But Jed's the sort who'll make trouble if he can't get his way. Just be careful. Standing close to a man like Chayton, you'll be standing in the line of fire when it comes." She thought of the tracks in the snow, and the long shadow they cast over her days. "Maybe I already am," she said, and left him there. That evening, she made the walk to her house with the sense of being followed again. Not by the watchers, by Chayton. He kept his distance as always, his presence a quiet tether between her and the rest of the night. The snow was falling softly, muffling even the sound of her boots, when she stopped short. "You don't have to do this," she called back over her shoulder. For a moment, he didn't move. Then his voice came, deep enough to feel more than hear. "Some storms you watch from inside. Some you walk through." She almost asked him which this was, but his eyes in the dim light were answer enough. 2 nights later, she heard a knock, not at her door, but on her window. She pushed aside the curtain and saw Tala, bundled in her coat, breath clouding in the cold. "Pa says you should stay inside tonight," the girl said. "Tracks again." Evelyn nodded and stepped back, but the girl lingered a moment longer, looking as though there was something else she wanted to say. In the end, she only pulled her scarf tighter and disappeared into the white. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind against the shutters made her imagine men outside, their boots pressing deep circles in the snow. She rose before dawn, lit her lamp, and found herself staring out toward the cabin. There was no movement, only the dim outline of smoke rising against the paling sky. By midday, the weather softened. Evelyn walked into town and found Chayton at the edge of the livery yard, speaking with Doc Raines. He stood with one hand resting on Tala's shoulder, his other holding the sled by its rope. The doctor looked uneasy. "Just telling you," Doc was saying. "There's talk you might want to hear. Jed's been drinking more than usual, and when he does, he gets loud about what he thinks ought to be done. Might be nothing, but might be something." Chayton gave a single nod, eyes narrowing slightly. Tala looked up at him, then at Evelyn. For a heartbeat, the girl's expression shifted from guarded to relieved, and Evelyn felt the same unspoken recognition pass between them that she had with Chayton. On her way home, Evelyn noticed the tracks again. Fresh, deep, cutting across the open field behind the cabin. Whoever left them hadn't been afraid of being seen. She followed them with her eyes until they blurred into the white horizon. That night, the air felt heavier, the quiet not the kind that rests but the kind that waits. She sat at her table, lamp turned low, thinking of storms. The kind you watch from a window and the kind you walk through. She didn't know yet which one had found them, only that it was coming closer. The storm had returned by nightfall, carrying a different kind of cold. One that bit deep into the bone, not with sharpness but with weight. Snow fell in restless sheets, hissing softly where it met the lanterns along the street. The wind worried at the eaves and rattled the loose boards of sheds. Evelyn felt it in her skin. The night was holding its breath. She had just left the mercantile, her basket tucked under her arm, when she caught movement near the pump at the far end of the street. A small figure struggled against the wind. Tala, head down, coat flapping open where the buttons had come loose. She carried a small bucket, the kind that barely held enough water for a night's needs. Evelyn frowned. Chayton would never have sent her out alone, not after the tracks they'd been seeing. She was about to call out when 3 shadows slid from behind the feed store. They moved with the restless energy of men who'd already decided what they were about to do. "Out late, aren't you?" The voice was male, coarse with drink. A second man stepped into the lantern light. Jed Carter's foreman, shoulders hunched, mouth curled in a smirk. Tala stopped short. "I just need water," she said, voice barely audible over the wind. One of them laughed and moved closer, boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Don't you know it's dangerous for little half-breeds out in the dark?" Evelyn's legs were already moving before she thought. The basket swung at her side, beans thudding against the wicker as she closed the distance. "Leave her be!" she shouted, the wind carrying her words like sparks. The men turned. Another figure emerged from the dark. Sammy Carter, lanky and mean-eyed, scarf pulled up over his mouth. He gave Evelyn a slow once-over. "Just keeping her company, Mrs. Harper. No harm in that." The foreman's hand shot out, catching Tala by the arm. She yanked back, but his grip tightened. "Careful now," he said. "Wouldn't want you falling into the trough." He glanced at the frozen basin, its surface glinting under the lantern light. Evelyn stepped forward, every nerve in her body hot despite the cold. "Let her go." Sammy moved between them, smirking. "You should mind your own business." The foreman gave Tala a shove. Her boots skidded on the ice, the bucket tipping, water splashing dark against the snow. She cried out, scrambling for balance, but the smaller man grabbed her shoulder and pushed harder. The crack of breaking ice rang sharp in the night as one of her feet plunged into the frigid water. Evelyn lunged, but a shadow moved faster. It came from the darkness behind the pump, silent, sudden, purposeful. In an instant, one man was down in the snow, his breath driven out with a grunt. The other's arm was twisted behind his back, before he could reach for the knife at his belt. Sammy staggered back, eyes wide. Chayton stood over them, bare to the waist despite the storm, the muscles of his chest and arms slick with melting snow. His breath rose in slow clouds, steady as if the cold were nothing to him. "You will not touch her again," he said, voice low, each word weighted with finality. The foreman tried to jerk free. Chayton's grip only tightened. The sound of tendons straining carried in the silence before a choked cry escaped the man. Sammy swore and took a step forward, but stopped when Chayton's gaze shifted to him. It wasn't a glare. It was the unblinking, measuring look of a man who had already decided what he would do if pushed one step further. Sammy's mouth snapped shut. Boot steps pounded on the boardwalk. Marshal Boone appeared, coat flaring behind him, hand near his holster. "Enough!" he barked, stepping between them. "Everyone go home before I haul you all in." Chayton released the foreman, who stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. The man spat into the snow, but the look in his eyes wasn't bravado. It was the careful calculation of someone who'd learned how close he'd come to being broken. "Get out of here," Boone ordered, and the men obeyed, muttering under their breath as they vanished into the white. Sammy lingered a heartbeat longer, but Chayton's presence sent him following the others without another word. The wind gusted hard, tugging at Evelyn's skirts. She turned to find Tala shivering, her foot still wet from the trough. Evelyn crouched, wrapping her own shawl around the girl's shoulders. "You're all right now," she murmured, brushing damp hair from her face. Chayton stood a few paces away, his body still and his eyes fixed on the shadows where the men had gone. Boone stepped closer to him. "You keep this up, Chayton, and the Carters will make sure you've got no place left to stand in this town." Chayton didn't answer. He looked past the marshal to Evelyn and Tala, his gaze softening just enough to be felt. Back at the cabin, the fire crackled low. Evelyn helped Tala out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in blankets. She could feel Chayton's presence at her back, silent and immovable, like the logs holding up the walls. "She's safe," Evelyn said finally, glancing at him. His eyes met hers. For a moment, something passed there, a flicker of gratitude, unspoken but clear. He gave a single nod and turned toward the fire, the orange light painting his skin in shifting patterns. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls, as if trying to get in. It would not be the last time the night came for them. The storm did not stop with the night. It grew heavier by morning, burying the streets, weighing down the eaves until icicles hung like rows of glass knives. The world was made of white and wind, and even the sound of the church bell was swallowed before it could cross the square. Evelyn woke to the cold press of air seeping through the chinks in her shutters. She dressed by lamplight, pulling her wool skirt over her stockings, buttoning her bodice with numb fingers. Outside, the snow lay unbroken, smooth as paper, except for the tracks. They were back again, leading down from the road, and stopping just shy of her porch before turning toward the edge of town. Whoever had been there hadn't knocked. A pounding came minutes later, not at her own door, but hard and urgent from the next street over. She heard it even through the howl of the wind. By the time she opened her door, Marshal Boone was striding toward her, his hat low against the gale. His mustache was rimmed with ice, his eyes sharp. "They're going after him," Boone said without preamble. Jed Carter, 2 of his men, maybe more, took rifles and went out toward the Comanche's cabin. The cold in Evelyn's chest had nothing to do with the weather. "Tala. She's with him," Boone said. "But there's a storm coming down hard, and I don't know if I can get there in time alone." Evelyn didn't answer. She threw her shawl over her shoulders, pulled on her gloves, and stepped into the snow. Boone swore under his breath, but didn't try to stop her. They fought their way up the ridge, the wind clawing at their faces, boots breaking through drifts that pulled at their legs. The cabin appeared through the white like something grown from the earth, low, dark, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. And there, already standing in front of it, was Chayton. He wore no shirt, only the hide leggings and moccasins of his people, his skin steaming faintly where the snow touched him. In his hands he held a hunting bow, the arrow already nocked. His hair was wild in the wind, black against the white world, and his face was carved from something older than the mountains. "They're coming," Boone called over the gale. "I know," Chayton said. His voice was low but carried, as if the storm itself made way for it. Evelyn reached him, her breath tearing in her chest. "You can't face them alone." He looked at her then, and the faintest shadow of a smile touched his mouth. "You are here." It was not a reassurance, it was a fact, and one he accepted without surprise. Through the curtain of snow, shapes began to emerge. 3 riders at first, then 5, rifles slung across their backs, faces half hidden by scarves. Jed Carter led them, his bulk unmistakable, his eyes narrow against the wind. They reined in about 20 paces away, their horses restless under them. Jed's voice came harsh and thin through the white. "You've had your fun, Indian. Time to take your half-breed and get off our land." "This is not your land," Chayton said, his tone still calm. Jed spat into the snow. "It is when I say it is. You've had warnings. You've had chances. Now we'll make sure you understand." He shifted in the saddle, glancing toward one of his men. The man began to dismount, rifle in hand. The bowstring drew back in a single, smooth motion. The arrow's head glinted dully in the gray light. "Step away," Chayton said. The man froze, one boot still in the stirrup. Jed's lip curled. "You gonna shoot us all, boy? There's more of us than there are of you." Boone stepped forward, his badge catching a stray flicker of light. "This is the last warning for all of you. Turn back now and go home." No one moved. The wind screamed through the gap between the ridge and the pines, lifting veils of snow into the air. Evelyn could feel the tremor in her own hands, not fear for herself, but for the small figure she saw peeking from the doorway of the cabin. Tala's eyes were wide, her blanket drawn up to her chin. Jed saw her too, and something mean and deep lit in his gaze. He jerked his chin toward her, and one of his men shifted his rifle to his shoulder. The arrow loosed. It struck the snow at the man's feet, so close he stumbled back in shock. Before he could recover, Chayton had drawn another. This time, the aim was higher. His voice was different now, no longer quiet, but carrying a raw edge that made the horses sidestep. "You point that again, you will not see another sunrise." Jed's men wavered. Two turned their mounts, muttering. But Jed himself swung down from his saddle, stomping forward until he stood within a dozen paces. His rifle stayed in his hand. "You think you can scare me?" he said. "You think you can keep her here when we've decided otherwise?" The snow muffled everything but the sound of his boots and the thud of Evelyn's heartbeat. She stepped forward before she realized it, putting herself between Jed and the cabin door. "You'll go through me first," she said. Jed's laugh was short and ugly. "You? You're nothing but a lonely little widow hanging on a savage's arm." The words landed hard, but she didn't move. Chayton's gaze flicked to her, and in that brief exchange something passed between them. A silent recognition that there would be no more retreating. The moment broke with a sudden crash of movement. One of Jed's men lunged toward the cabin, boots churning through the snow. Chayton moved like the wind itself, closing the distance in 3 strides, striking the man with the flat of his bow so hard he went down gasping. The bow came up again, blocking the swing of another rifle butt, then driving forward into the man's chest. The fight spilled into the storm, shapes and shouts blurred by the wind, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. Boone fired a warning shot into the air, the report rolling away into the white distance. When the snow cleared enough to see, 3 of Jed's men were on the ground, groaning or clutching bruised limbs. Jed himself was down on one knee, Boone's revolver trained on him. "You've got 2 choices, Carter," Boone said. "You walk away now, or I take you in and let the judge hear what happened here tonight." Jed's breath steamed in quick bursts. His eyes shifted from Boone to Chayton, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might lunge anyway. But something in Chayton's stillness, shirtless in the storm, bow at his side, made him spit into the snow and get to his feet instead. "Fine," he said. "But this isn't over." "It is," Boone replied. "Go." The riders pulled away one by one, their shapes swallowed by the curtain of snow until the ridge was empty again. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind and the soft creak of leather as Chayton lowered his bow. Evelyn turned toward the cabin. Tala was still in the doorway, her eyes locked on her father. He crossed to her, taking her face gently in his hands, speaking to her in Comanche. Her shoulders eased. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Evelyn helped Tala out of her blanket and set her near the hearth. Chayton stood nearby, the heat from the flames steaming away the last of the snow clinging to his skin. After a long silence he spoke. Not to Evelyn, not to Boone, but to the room itself, as though the walls and the fire needed to hear. "My people say a storm chooses who survives. Today, it chose us." Evelyn met his eyes. There was no smile there, but there was something else, something that felt like the beginning of trust. She knew in the quiet of that moment that she would stand beside him again if the storm came back. The white silence outside had broken, but in its place was something steadier, a promise, fragile but real, that not all winters end in loss. And somewhere, deep in the snow-laden pines, the wind carried the sound away, leaving the cabin wrapped in a stillness that was not fear but peace. Some storms pass over. Others change the land forever. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they change you too. Now, click on the story waiting for you, one harsher than this, one that will cut you to the bone, but warm you before the end. Go on. I'll be here.